Welcome to the first section of the Senior Seminar Capstone Series project. Today we're going to be talking about all things production, but mostly today we're going to be talking about all things camera and audio production. First, we're going to introduce the camera that we are going to be using today. Today we're going to be using the Panasonic P2 camera. These are going to be similar to the HMC 150s or the DVX 200s that you will be using in your classes here at Rowan University. Let's talk a little bit about the tips that I'm going to have for you today. We're going to have 5 simple and helpful tips that I have learned here that I'm going to be showing to you and teaching you about that have to do with both audio and video production. With that being said, let's get into the first tip. The first tip that we're going to be talking about today is exposure. Obviously, with cameras like the HMC 150 or the P2 that we have here today, we have what are called ND filters and exposure to help with your shots when you're out shooting in the field like we are here today on Bunce Green or in the studio. So obviously we're out here, it's a bright sunny day. We're lucky to have sunshine here, and it's just an overall really bright, shiny day with what we would consider in the field a little bit too much light. So what we have to do with this is we have to work on our exposure or our white balance and how we can fix that. Obviously, with a camera like this, we have ND filters. We have your quarter, we have your 16th, and we have your 64th, which all can be applied together to darken your shot, which allows for less light into the camera to make your shot perfectly lit, we would like to say in the industry. Obviously, besides putting on ND filters, we have the exposure ring. Obviously, with the exposure ring, we can do so much more with the shot that normally an ND filter, only with the ND filter on, we can't accomplish putting together a decent looking shot. What I mean by the exposure ring, for example, on these cameras, the exposure ring right here allows us to adjust the aperture. The aperture, or the f-stop, is what determines how much light comes into the camera, and how much light into the shot is what it looks like. For example, with these ND filters, we make the shot look really dark. If you put only the quarter one on, you still have a lot of light. If you put the 16th, it adds on to the quarter. Once you put on the 64th, it adds on again. For an example type of scenario where you would see ND filters and we would have to worry about an exposure, let's take a perfect example with hockey shoots. When we go out and do a hockey shoot, we're having to deal with the bright lights from the fluorescent lights above. Perfect example at Hollydale Ice Arena, where we cover Rowan hockey. When we look at how much light is coming from those lights onto the ice, it creates a really bright reflection. It's a white, bright surface with fluorescent lights shining down on it. It is one of the most complicated lighting scenarios when it comes to us shooting in the production field. So what do? We put on ND filters. Yes, we put on ND filters inside for the ice rink. But also, sometimes the ND filters just aren't enough, or that the shot's too dark. So we use the exposure wheel to fix those shots. Now that we're back here out on Bunce Green, again, today is a bright day. So what did we have to do? We had to put on ND filters, and we had to work with the exposure wheel to find the perfect shot. Let's move on to tip number 2. For the second tip, we obviously brought it up a little bit with when I was talking about exposure. We're going to be working now with white balance. Obviously, with most of these cameras, you have the capacity to white balance. Very quick and very simple. But there are also presets on these cameras, similar to the P2 and to the HMC 150, that allow us to take transition shots from inside and outside and have the power to transition with the shot. We can go from an inside shot, walk outside to an outside shot, and your white balance is still set. What do I mean by that? Well, on these cameras, we have presets A and B in your white balance features on these cameras. What this means is we can set, for example, let's say we're going to go inside. When we go inside, we will white balance the camera to channel A, and then we will be all set to shoot inside. Same example goes for when we're shooting outside, like we are here today. When we're shooting outside, I can set my preset to channel B, which would allow us to go from inside to outside. I can flip the switch from channel A to channel B and make that smooth transition for white balancing. Obviously, we don't do these type of things with sport shoots. Most of the time, we're dealing only with the one white balance when we go and shoot at hockey. Most of the time, white balancing at hockey can be a bit difficult with the white bright light. Sometimes the shot will just look really blue at first. Sometimes the shot will look really red. It's up to us to make sure that the cameras are white balanced, that the shot looks good, and that we're all prepared when we go out to shoot some hockey. With that, we are done with white balancing and exposure. Now it's time to move on to tip number 3, where we'll be talking about all things focus. The third tip that we're going to go over today has to deal with the focus. Obviously, with shooting out in the field, focus is key. Focus is the most important step, in my opinion, on making sure that you use the best equipment to your ability. What tips do I have for focus, you might ask? For cameras like this P2 or for cameras like the HMC 150 and the DVX 200, we have the feature that is known as zebra lines. Now you may be wondering, how do zebra lines have to do with anything with focus? Well, I'm going to tell you. Zebra lines are what we can apply on to the focus of our shots to make sure that they look to be in focus fully. To the naked eye, you may think your shot is in focus when you look at that monitor and you're like, oh, okay, we're ready to go. And you look back in that footage and you go, wow, that wasn't in focus like I thought it was. When you're out in the field, we can use things known as zebra lines, like I said. And what that allows us to do is, for cameras, sometimes it's red lines. For other cameras, it's green lines. What it does when we apply it to the camera is, when you look into that monitor and you're setting your focus, what happens is these lines pop up to outline what is in focus and help you to achieve the best focus that you can when it comes to shooting for hockey. For example, when we're out at hockey, we make sure that we use zebra lines to make sure that our shots are in focus, whether that be using one of our close-up cameras to get a shot of, let's say, the goalie or a face-off, or when we're using a wide camera just to make sure that everything that we have on the ice is in focus, whether or not we're using it for sideline cameras, whether or not we're using it when we do our commentary intros. For example, when we're working with Gary, who's one of our broadcasters, we have to make sure that he is in focus to produce great quality work. If he's not in focus, the shot's going to look a little bit off. Everything's not going to look the same the way it should when we are out doing hockey. Same follows with every sport, not just hockey that we cover right now. Same thing goes for when we're covering football, when we're covering baseball, when we're covering basketball, when we're covering soccer. Everything needs to be in focus to make sure that we're getting the best out of our production. With focus and exposure and white balancing, all 3 key tips that I think are important, both for production, making sure that you have these all achieved. Let's move on to the audio side of production and the 4th tip that I have for you today. Tip number 4 is going to do with all things audio, but most importantly to do with the annoying power of the wind. Yes, we always try to get good quality audio, but sometimes Mother Nature just doesn't want to agree with us when we're out in the field. For example, today, we're out here on Bunts Green. It's a little bit windy. So what can we do to fix this problem, you ask? We can add a windscreen. What does the windscreen do? The windscreen does exactly what it sounds like. The windscreen has the power and the capability, when it is placed over the microphone, whether or not it be a lavalier microphone like the one I'm using, or it could be a shotgun microphone, whether or not you're shooting a film or a TV project where you're not really miking up your talent, but more or less trying to get ambient noise or the noise all around you. So with the power of the windscreen, we can reduce the amount of noise that goes into the microphone, in which case can ruin your audio. The wind has the power to ruin your audio with the amount of noise that it can put into the microphone. But with the power of the windscreen, we can get rid of that audio, and so that you can produce really great sounding audio, whether or not it be out here in the field, whether or not it be you're out shooting a football game per se or a soccer game. Usually in the fall, the weather conditions could be a little bit windy. So when you're out with your broadcasters, usually we will put on windscreens or covers on the microphones to make sure that when the commentators are talking, whether or not it be for a sports shoot or not, whether or not they're on camera or off camera, that we are making sure that they have really great quality sounding audio so that the entire production goes along without a hitch. With that, that is tip number 4. We move on to tip number 5, the final tip that we need to put forth really great quality work here at Rowan. We move on to the 5th and final tip of this first section of the Senior Seminar Capstone Series project, where we will be going over audio levels. Obviously, audio levels are key to making sure that you can hear your talent while they are talking on camera. Obviously, audio levels can be a little bit tricky whether or not we're outside, whether or not we're inside, and all of the noise around you. Obviously, on a day like today, we're going to want the audio a little bit louder just because of the wind. Obviously, we have the windscreen on our lavalier microphone, but sometimes with the lavalier and with trying to avoid wind and everything, sometimes the noise can be a little bit muffled, and it also depends on your talent. Sometimes your talent may talk a little bit lower, so you may have to adjust your audio levels. On cameras like the P2, we have wheels on the bottom sides of these cameras right here that can allow you to adjust the audio for your talent. Obviously, sometimes you may think, oh, I may only put channel 1 audio in. Channel 1's only going to really give you your left side of your ear sometimes. What you may end up finding maybe the best thing to do is making sure channel 1 and channel 2 both are set for your first subject. Those are just some of the key things that we need to look over first when we go over audio levels. Obviously, we want to make sure that our audio sounds really clear, not too loud, but also not too quiet. So the perfect levels that we're trying to set at all times is between -12 and -6 decibels to make sure that your talent, again, isn't really talking really loud at -3 or really quiet at -15 or -18. Well, those are just some of the helpful tips that I think are essential as radio, television, and film students to know and kind of a little bit more understand some things that may or may not be put together outside of the classroom, whether or not it be at a sporting event that you decide to join as a club on campus covering sports, or whether or not you're just freelancing. And some of these aspects I think are really key to know and understand, whether or not you're shooting in the studio or whether or not you're shooting outside here like we are here today. Well, that will do it for the first section of the Senior Seminar Capstone Series project. We hope that you enjoyed the first section where we went over all things audio and video, and stay tuned for section 2 where we'll be putting these skills to the test with working on our very own live event production. So with that will conclude the first section, and stay tuned for section 2.